One of the more common questions that we get from patients is, are there certain dietary modifications that I can make to make me pee less? There are a ton of them. Let's get into it. Let's talk about it. Stay tuned, guys. Hey guys, Dr. Segel here. So the question is, can't I just change my diet so I pee less? My friend told me that I can. The short answer is yes, you can. And oftentimes, patients don't want to be on a medication. They don't want a surgery for their overactive bladder, but the symptoms are driving them bananas. And one of the first concepts that I tell people, and it's not necessarily a particular food that they eat, but it's the speed with which their bladder fills up. So this is your bladder. These two areas here, these are called the ureteral orifices. This is where the urine comes from the kidney down to the bladder. There are certain foods and drinks that will cause your bladder to fill up more quickly. Um, Alcohol is one of them. It's a known what we call diuretic, which means that it's going to cause the kidneys to form urine more quickly, and that urine is going to get excreted to the bladder. So alcohol is one of them. Also, just a high bolus or a high amount of volume simultaneously. So oftentimes I'll talk to people about their diet, and they'll say that, yeah, I had a great lunch. I had a bottle of water, soup, and then something else to drink. And that sheer volume of fluid that's going into the bladder is going to be more sensitive, especially if you already have a tendency towards overactive bladder symptoms. As this bladder fills up more quickly, it's going to be more likely to involuntarily contract. Whereas if it's important to drink a lot of water, but if you drink it on a more regular basis throughout the day instead of all at once, then your overactive bladder symptoms can certainly get markedly better just from decreasing the amount of fluids that you take in one sitting. In general, in medicine, we feel like if things fill up or change over time, the body is less likely to recognize it. And that's no different in this circumstance with the bladder. If the bladder's filling up more slowly, then it's less likely to squeeze spontaneously, and you're less likely to have urgency and frequency. It's an example of a way that you can think about how quickly you fill up your bladder to decrease your overactive bladder symptoms. Now, some people have to be on diuretics, and there's no way around that. Their other prescribers want them on that medication, but there are some dietary modifications you can make. I'm going to list 15 foods that can irritate the lining of the bladder in no particular order. And I'm going to list them slowly so you can jot them down. And then we'll talk about, after I list these foods, we can talk about a rational way to do what's called an elimination diet, or figure out which one of these is the culprit for your overactive bladder symptoms, or maybe none of them are. But we'll talk about the way that we do that. The first one I'll say is carbonated water. Something about those bubbles irritate the lining of the bladder, and that's really any carbonated beverage. Caffeinated beverages, okay, that can irritate the lining of the bladder, not to mention that caffeine itself is a diuretic, so urine's going to flow more readily into the bladder. So the same concept that we talked about before, your bladder's going to fill up more quickly. Chocolate, I hate to tell you that, and my wife would hate to hear that, but chocolate for sure. Alcoholic beverages, the alcohol itself can irritate the lining of the bladder, but also alcohol is a diuretic, so fluid's going to go into the bladder more quickly. Sports drinks, Gatorade, Powerade, these sorts of things. Citrus fruit, tomatoes, and people aren't taking a bite out of a tomato, but a ton of food has tomatoes. Spicy foods can irritate the lining of the bladder. Foods containing artificial colorings, foods that have preservatives, foods that contain a high amount of sugar or sugar substitutes. I've certainly seen artificial sweeteners be the only culprit in somebody's overactive bladder symptoms, without a doubt. Honey, raw onion, smoking, And I think we mentioned acidic foods. So that's a brief list of common bladder irritants. And when I read this list to people, the first thing that people tell me is, you are trying to take away everything fun in my life. And they'd rather just be on a pill. But you don't have to get rid of all of these. What I usually tell people is, think about, when you look at this list of bladder irritants, put them in order of what's most important to you to have and what's least important for you to have. And then take the bottom of the list, so the one that you don't care that much about, but you still may have it relatively frequently, and stop that for a week and see what happens. A week's really a good enough time period to see if it's going to change the way that you urinate, and do your best to try to keep every other aspect of your diet unchanged. After a week, move on to the next one, and move up the list until hopefully you find one that's the trigger point, the trigger food or drink that's causing your symptoms. Then you can stop, right? Because then you don't have to sacrifice the ones that you like a whole lot more. So that's a rational way to do an elimination diet. Some people will find 4 or 5 things on the list, and they'll tell me, what am I going to do? I'm going to starve. I love spaghetti and meatballs. I drink a ton of Powerade. Citrus fruits are super important to me. And then we have a conversation about potential substitutes, right? Things that are what I like to call bladder-friendly foods, foods that are less likely to irritate the lining of the bladder. So I want to just talk about those, and I'll say them relatively slowly so you can jot those down. So lean proteins, bladder-friendly food, okay? Fish, chicken breast, turkey, low-fat beef, low-fat pork are good options. Eggs, too. Eggs are a bladder-friendly food. Fiber-rich foods are, in general, good for your bladder. And the reason for that is the rectum and the GI tract neighbors the bladder, right? So if you're having a high-fiber diet, stool's going to exit your body more efficiently and be less likely to push on the bladder. And if there's less mechanical pressure on the bladder, then you're going to feel like you have to go less. That's a super common reason why kids have urinating issues, or what we call voiding dysfunction. It's constipation. So high fiber foods can decrease that pressure on the bladder because there's less stool that's pushing on the bladder from the GI tract. So that's an important one too. Some people get really upset at the prospect of sacrificing fruit in their diet if it irritates the lining of the bladder. So a lot of good fruit substitutes can be used. Bananas, apples, grapes, coconut, watermelon. These are all good options for people with an overactive bladder, as opposed to citrus or acidic fruit options. Vegetables are great. Leafy greens, kale, lettuce, cucumber, squash, potatoes, broccoli, carrots, celery, bell peppers. All these are options. I feel like I'm listing all the foods that my wife tells me to eat that I don't eat enough of. Nuts are a good option too. Whole grains, barley, farro, these sorts of things are bladder-friendly foods. Now, what'll happen is, if you can institute a lot of these foods into your diet at the expense of some of the foods that we mentioned before that can irritate the lining of the bladder, you're going to lose weight. All right? And most everybody wants to lose some weight. The importance of that, and this is my pearl of wisdom, is one of the causes of overactive bladder, feeling like you got to go all the time, urgency, frequency, is mechanical push on the bladder. So bladder's here. If individuals are overweight, there's fat that sits all around the bladder, all in the pelvis. And people that lose weight by instituting kind of some of the dietary changes that I mentioned have less of this fat around the bladder, less of its pushing on the bladder, and that decrease in the mechanical force on the bladder makes them feel like they have to go less. So the byproduct of all these dietary changes, hopefully, is that you're losing weight and then there's less mechanical force on the bladder. And when there's less squeeze on the bladder from kind of the neighboring structures in the pelvis, specifically the fat in the pelvis, then you're going to feel like you have to go less. So that's kind of an added benefit of these dietary changes. I hope that's helpful to you all. I hope that it gives you a framework for things that you can do that aren't medications and aren't even necessarily biofeedback or pelvic floor physical therapy, or certainly not procedures that you can institute tomorrow so that the overactive bladder symptoms that are ruling your life are not ruling them anymore. Thank you so much for listening. We certainly appreciate it. Please subscribe to our channel. Check out this playlist. Thanks again, guys.